and elsewhere that are prized, that we own them as a country, and that they're still sacred to us as beautiful and inspiring places. But how did we learn about them? Well, uh, oh, I have to do this again. Okay. What opened the West? I know this is kind of an opening question, but what really opened the West? Was it gold? Was it something else? Yes, it was something else. The beaver opened the West, not by digging tunnels, but because people wanted its fur. And so, who were the first Anglos in the West? And in fact, through most of the wilderness in the North, it was trappers. And just maybe with a mule and a horse and a buddy or two, they went all over Canada and then eventually began to move across the United States. Trapping, not an easy way to get beaver. You have to get in the water, you have to carry these heavy steel traps. Often they get your fingers or your hands. Sometimes you can use traditional ways, but mostly you use these traps, and you have to know a little bit about the animals. As a kid, my only source of allowance was I trapped muskrats. Never saw a beaver till I got west, but muskrats were abounding, and I skinned them, tanned them. I refused to eat them, however. They're a little bit hard to dry and tan. Usually you scrape the fat off of them. Sometimes the pelts would have the long furs taken off of them, but you brought them in stacked. And why? Because people in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s especially really demanded beaver for hats, for coats, for blankets, all sorts of things. And of course, Europe had no beaver. They had mink and fox, but they had no beaver. America had all the beaver. And one of the great companies that allowed this to happen was the Hudson Bay Company, founded 1670. It's almost the same time as Jamestown. And they spread not only dry goods, but they would trade dry goods in a whole series of trading centers, trading forts. They could get into Hudson Bay, and going by river, they established a whole series of trading forts all the way to Fort Vancouver, which made us a little worried that the British were kind of crossing territorial lines. But they were our model about how to do this. And Indians would come in with various kinds of other furs, and there was trade goods, lots of trade goods, axes, chisels, knives, bells. That was one of the great baubles to tie on your legs for dancing. And of course, these wonderful blankets, which could be made into coats and beads and so on. It would take 11 stacked up that were called made beaver. That is, they're already kind of stretched and degreased. It would take 11 to buy a gun. And one of our American counterparts, a familiar name, he was a German immigrant and decided, I can do what the Canadians and British are doing, and he founded an American fur company. It became the Pacific soon. He became essentially America's first millionaire. And he moved, like the fur traders did, he decided he would go up the Columbia River and build a fort, a trading fort, and set up trading forts throughout the Americas. So the Pacific Fur Company, which is what it became, had a series of forts across the United States. But they were very good because they made it all the way to the Pacific and set up a fort on basically Oregon coast. And then, of course, John Jacob Astor founded a town there, Astoria. And then he went back to New York once he had his millions and started hotels. But by the early 1800s, there were almost a dozen trading companies. Many of these worked with one company and then went to another company, and sometimes a couple of trappers would get together and trade as a team. Here's William H. Ashley, who put a little ad saying, I want 100 men who don't mind getting cold or wet, and I'm going to start a trapping fur trading company. And he didn't, he was unique because he didn't really set up forts. He just set up kind of these rendezvous areas, and people would gather there, and kind of an open market. Among his early people were Jedediah Smith and Jim Beckworth and others, that names you may not know well, but you will hear some of them. So the American fur traders, moving in 1811, were already going up the Missouri. The Mississippi, once you got up there, you were in Canadian country. So people would go up the Missouri, then come across and try to get onto the Columbia. And of course, here was Astoria. Astoria wasn't set up until after Lewis and Clark went there. But the British interest, and especially Hudson Bay Company, came all the way to the coast. There were fur trading both from Americans and from Russians coming down. And so this area was always contested. In fact, there were a couple of wars fought over who actually owned the rights in here. And that was part of what the core of discovery was all about. Not only did these guys go out on their own for a long time, they had to encounter the weather and cold, but they would also look forward to getting together in various kind of spots that they all knew about, or if they didn't know about, they would probably be dead. And these were called rendezvous places. Some of them had a trading post. Most of them just were big sites that were a little warmer, and they could be a fall or a spring rendezvous or even a winter one. I put the Pitt River because it was a very important one for trappers who had come from not Salt Lake, but from Cache Valley and the Bear Lake, Great Bear Lake, and come all the way down along the Humboldt River and then down, and I'll show you the route they would take, and some very, very important names attached with all those guys. At the same time, the Russians were coming down, but they did it a little differently. They hired, or enslaved Inuits and other coastal Indians who came with their kayaks, and they were after sea otter, which was, American trappers weren't there yet. So the West Coast trading was largely up to the British and the Russians. Tremendous number of beaver trapped. We know about maybe 60 million bison, but there's probably an equal number of beaver. This is the intake, that is beaver traded at two big forts, Albany Fort and York Fort, our factory. You can see the decline. The price, of course, would skyrocket all the way, and this isn't even 1800 yet. So tremendous demand, diminishing supply. So had to go west. If you want the beaver, you go west. And so many numbers of people, Jim Bridger, who was an early trapper and then became an Army scout and wilderness guide. And think about these guys going out at 18, and there wasn't much out there. So you've maybe found another person to travel with you. This is in the Great Plains, and this is the Rockies. All these places he explored for 20 years or so. He eventually set up a fort that actually would had a forge and supplies, and so he could fix wagons. And this was along the Northern Oregon Trail, just before it split off to the basically Mormon Trail. So many of these guys could speak multiple languages. They often had Indian wives, or at least on good terms. They had to be on good terms with the local Indians. And of course, they were very productive. These up here are beaver and bear, but the are bison and bear, but this is all beaver, and then probably mink. It looks like ermine and mink, badger right there. And by the way, people still do this, and they're very proud of their heritage, like to dress the part. They still have rendezvous, mountain men rendezvous, which they come and show off their skills, and they pride themselves in making these costumes and using single fire rifles. And these, of course, are beaver traps. Jedediah Smith, what a middle name. He actually answered a newspaper ad as a teen, and he came to St. Louis, which was a jump-off spot. I mean, St. Louis, Missouri, that doesn't sound like the West, it's the Midwest, and it was the Midwest, but it was the jump-off point because Missouri, the Mississippi River, and so on, all came there, and you could get west by following these. And so he signed up with Ashley's group, then later went on his own to become part of the great Bear Lake Company. And the Bear Lake Company was up here. So he had gone up this way a lot, come down this way. Then he formed, along with Jim Bridger and a few other people, and later, believe it or not, Kit Carson. His real name was Christopher. But right here, almost on the border, was a Great Bear. And they would start, and they would come along the Humboldt River. This map is wrong, but they would follow the Humboldt River into the Humboldt Sink. Then they would come along the eastern edge of the Sierra Nevada, because it was very difficult to cross, and they usually came in the spring, so it's snow covered. Then they crossed, and depending where they crossed, around Tehachapi. Later, a man named Walker found a shortcut there, Walker Pass, and then they would come up the San Joaquin Valley, and quite often they would go up the Sacramento, up the McCloud, up the Pit, and here they would have another rendezvous. Because the Sierra Nevada kind of pooped out there, they could come around, join up the Humboldt River again, or follow the Snake River plain all the way up here, and they would make a circuit getting back in the late fall. And they did that for a number of years, over a decade, walking or with horses in this loop. Sometimes they would get held up or imprisoned, as in the case of Jed Smith. He got arrested because he got too close, they felt, and so he was arrested and taken to Los Angeles, put in jail. He eventually broke out, and then because he was being chased, he found a shortcut through the Stanislaus. And Kit Carson was in the same dilemma one time, and he found another shortcut right here, and we call that Carson Pass. So there are reasons certain things are named that way. Jed Smith also had to cross the southern Mojave because he really wasn't going to try to go into Los Angeles again, because the Spanish were there. He was trying to get into some other untrapped areas, but so he pioneered a whole bunch of routes, and one of the big routes he pioneered, he did come out to Monterey, out to San Jose and San Francisco because there were missions, but he also pioneered a route up the Pacific, and he ended up at Fort Vancouver. Then he just basically reversed what Lewis and Clark did. He just reversed and came back. So these guys really got around, and the hunting areas were here, and the trapping areas. And this was part of a big movement, a sort of religious movement that was inspired by Thomas Jefferson. It really wasn't held by a lot of people. Lincoln didn't like it. Felt that there was a divine right for the American people to move across the continent, unite the continent in one sort of ideology, which of course would be Christianity, one economy, one language, and so on. Sounds familiar. We still have that sort of manifest destiny. I love this painting because this is Columbia, and she's dragging power line across the United States and spreading education. I'm surprised she didn't have a Bible, but there it is. It's a school book. And of course, the sensible Indians are fleeing. Even the dogs are running and the bison are running, because here come the wagons, the stagecoach, here comes the trains. This is a great allegory. Even the bears are kind of pissed off. So this was manifest destiny, and it was fulfilled. Jefferson purchased Louisiana, and then we bartered for Oregon, Mexico. We fought for Texas, and then paid for another little addition here. So there was a very quick, in the early 1800s, a series of successions that and acquisitions that brought the manifest destiny to its fruition. And with that, various trails. I don't want to spend much time, but these trails all started ultimately from St. Louis, but then Independence grew very quickly, or Council Bluffs. But this was the main route up, and then along the Snake River, and then along the Columbia River, or actually they would cross at different places in the Cascades. Eventually, because of the Spanish, there was a southern route, the old Spanish Trail, and this was used also. We don't think about this, but a lot of wagon trains went this way, and this was part of the Great Mormon Route. And you see an image like this. This is a visualization of the great manifest destiny. You can see how dramatic, and God is watching the pioneers and the pilgrims. And of course, the men had to drive, the women walked. And this isn't very accurate, because mostly you took oxen to pull, because oxen would be later useful on the farm for plowing, and also for eating and selling. There was also, right after and before the Civil War, they knew what was brewing. There was a kind of exodus from the southeast, when people from the southeast started moving a little bit farther north and then west, and in fact into Kansas and Oklahoma. So a lot of African American people decided to do this. So this was a sort of land rush, and they were moved by a kind of seeking freedom, but also an idea of forming their own communities. And by the way, this was a time that the US, especially up in the Northeast, was undergoing what we call a second Great Awakening. And there was a revival, not just of Christianity, but all these new utopian communities that are fabulous to read about. You know the Shakers, but you may not know the Oneida or others. Many of them made things like silverware or refrigerators, Amana. These were interesting colonies, and these were set up by African descendant slaves in parts of Oklahoma. The Second Great Awakening felt that there needed to be a rejuvenating of the American Christian ideals. And so there was a revival zeal that swept across the country and also across the seas. People got very excited about missionary action. And there were some very stern looking ministers. Finney was actually a professor and president of Oberlin, but he was a very outspoken, very dramatic person. Many new religions came out of this as well, not just the Mormon church, but other strange ones like the Oneida or the Shakers. I can't think of some of the others right now, but many of them forming little colonies here and there. And they, like the African Americans moving this way out of the South, they moved down again toward Tennessee and Illinois and Missouri, which were part of the West at that point. Presbyterians and Methodists and others went to the American West to save the heathens there. The Methodists had circuit riders that were sent to all these little places to ride, to go to individual cabins and homesteads to spread the word. There was also the earliest forms of overseas missionaries from the American colonies. This was already pretty big in England, but overseas missions. But some people were going at this time in the late 1700s to Hawaii and the South Pacific Islands, because word was just coming back about them. It was quite a movement. Later, the Chautauqua system came out of this with kind of tent cities and so on. And another thing that was another poor beast that was very instrumental in really opening the West, the extreme West, was a sea otter. And sea otters basically were tied into Russian. And the Russians had settled very early into Alaska. They started hiring and conscripting Inuits and others with kayaks. They moved all the way up and down the coast. To feed themselves, they set up little farms in other places which were much more amenable to farming. So they set up Fort Ross in 1817, and that grew crops. And on their way back up, the ships would stop here to pick up food, and they had their holds filled with sea otter pelts. Another thing that the Russians did is they worked out a very interesting political deal with one of the chiefs on Kauai, and they established a Fort Elizabeth on Kauai, because they knew that most of their sea otter pelts were going to go to China. They were very sought after in Russia, but it was easier to send a lot of these directly to Hawaii than to China, rather than bringing them all the way up here and then taking them across to Yakutsk or someplace like that. One little aside, when this closed in early 1800s, a young prospector was traveling here, and he made a deal and he bought a lot of lumber from Fort Ross, and he took it over into the Central Valley up into the foothills, and he built a mill. His name was John Sutter, of course, and the mill sounds like a really great big place, but this is all it was. It was a series of shakers that you could wash the gravel and so on. Of course, John Sutter didn't find the gold. James Marshall found the gold in early January in 1848. Interestingly, Kit Carson heard about this on his way back to Utah. And Kit Carson took the word back to Missouri. So he's the one we should thank for spreading the word that California had gold. And the rest is not a pretty story. But wagon trains from the 1820s were already moving. First on the Santa Fe Trail, because that was already well mapped and many people had been over it. So later with Astor and so on, Astor had a couple of his teams mark out the Oregon Trail. So the Oregon and California Trail began to be used heavily by the 40s, 1840s, all the way into the 60s and 70s. Not until the railway did this actually stop. These wagons, of course, were not beds. They weren't campers. The kitchen wasn't in there. It's what everything you owned was in those wagons. These were light, removable or movable wagons. So this is part of the Santa Fe Trail that would come down to Santa Fe, and many people just followed the Rio Grande. It's a great place, good farming. There's a series of plains in here. Or if you wanted, you could come over the old Spanish Trail into California, which, if you look at this is pretty much Highway 66. We didn't put highways just anywhere. We used the old trail system. The Mormon Trail broke off at South Pass. They broke off and came down the Salt Lake, but they also came all the way down here into Mexico. And then if you continue on up to Oregon, you could go up into the Puget Sound area, or you could just follow it down. This was one of the first wagon masters, Peter Burnett, and very interesting. He was elected to head the wagon train. They left St. Louis in 1834, I think. And he was a lawyer. And when he got to Oregon, got very active in the politics and became a judge there. And in 1849, he led about 150 men down to California. And there he became very, very active in racist kind of politics. He enacted the Lash Law for African Americans who disobeyed or were disruptive. And you could also, in some cases, legally kill them. He also underwrote the apportionment that would allow Californians to kill Indians and demand and get a bounty. Could be a 25-cent bounty on their scalp, or a whole dollar or more for their head. He was not all that popular, thankfully, and was eventually forced out of office. So what did he do? He became a judge, but he was, in essence, the first governor of California when he enacted these laws. And one of the laws, which was on the books for a very long time, called the California Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, enacted in 1850 when he was governor. But it allowed not only the lash, but also allowed basically kidnapping. So if you felt that a child didn't belong with an Indian family, or if you just wanted a servant, you would take her, and that was legal. And then she would be raised by the family as a servant. So he basically legalized Indian slavery in California, as well as genocide. So things haven't changed all that much if you think about certain laws. So this is one of the massacres, a Pomo Indian massacre up in Clear Lake, that it was led by one of the generals, but they just massacred everyone they came across in this Pomo Indian village. Then we have to go, I love this, how angelic this guy looks. This is Joseph Smith, who, a very interesting story historically, if you don't know it, but he was persecuted after digging up some gold foiled books and translating them, which told about Jesus wandering around the South America and North America. Anyway, he had a lot of followers, and he fled to first Illinois, then went to Missouri and so on. And then he was eventually murdered while in prison. But his followers, especially Brigham Young, started to lead a brigade of wagon trains off of the Oregon Trail and coming down from South Pass, which is right about here, into Salt Lake, and then spreading out here. So this happened in 1847, but continued for 20, 30 years until trains came in. When the wagon trains ran out, they began to build hand carts, and families would have to really scrimp, put whatever they could find as possessions into this cart, and they would promptly march across the United States in this hand cart thing. So this, by the way, is reenacted every year. By this time they could leave from Iowa City, but this was the route of the hand carts, and various wards, as they're called, or bishoprics will reenact this, and it's kind of rite of passage. Conestoga wagons were used for the very first settlement along the East Coast, and of course crossing the Cumberland Gap and getting into the wilds of Tennessee and Kentucky. They were almost heavy battleships. They were hard to move unless there were actual roads. That's why once the real pioneering occurred, actually a little bit earlier, about the 1830s, people went to prairie schooners, and these prairie schooners were made by interesting companies. One of them, one of the best wagons was made by a company called Studebaker, and another one was made by International Harvester, or which would later become International Harvester. So these were the very first trucks. And as I said, this was much more maneuverable in Western landscapes, and family just, if they had a tent, if not, they went under the wagon and slept there all the way across the country. And wagon trains were often enormous, 200 or 300 wagons. And the other advantage of the prairie schooners is they were light enough to be actually rafted across certain places that would require portages. Here is a nice young family, the 69 in this particular one, with only 5 women. So imagine that. Here, of course, are oxen. The wagons were light enough too to be pulled by oxen. The Conestoga would take huge amounts of horses. Then when all of this was happening, the government decided, one, to buy parcels. And so the Louisiana Purchase, of course, said, okay, what did we buy? And then we wanted to know what else was out there. And one of the driving forces was, where should we put forts? Where should we have military bases? Where are the Spanish in all of this? Where exactly are the Canadians? So there was a whole series of sponsored expeditions. And many of these were very cognizant about having geologists, botanists, looking for useful plants, looking for metals, looking for anything. So these were huge expeditions, 200 people, almost all men. So Meriwether Lewis, of course, was a childhood friend of Thomas Jefferson, and well educated, and later worked as Jefferson's private secretary and aide. And once Jefferson dreamt of the idea of the Corps of Discovery, and this wasn't the only corps. He sent those corps to the Central Plains, to the Southwest itself, and to the sort of north into the Great Lakes area. Meriwether Lewis was asked to lead this. He later became, after the Corps came back, he was also asked to become territorial governor. His partner in all of this, I'll mention very carefully, Lewis sort of felt weighted down by the responsibility of everything, and he was sometimes prone to melancholy. He was a very good artist and writer, but afterwards he kind of wandered around, and on one night in 1809, just 3 years after the return, he basically was walking down the Natchez Trail, went into an inn. In the middle of the night, they heard some shots and found him dying on the floor. They still don't know whether he killed himself. Apparently he had attempted suicides in the weeks prior to this, but many people write books about that. And William Clark said, "I fear the weight of his mind has overcome him." And William Clark was a remarkable person himself. All 5 of his brothers fought in the Revolutionary War. He was well trained, very, very robust man, experienced as a riverboat person, and very sociable. And eventually, he was asked by Lewis to join his Corps of Discovery, and they would co-lead it. They agreed to do that. And of course, this is one of the great stories all the way up Missouri and into the Yellowstone River, then across the Rockies, down into the Snake River and then the Columbia River, overwintering in 05, 06 at Fort Clatsop, just south. And that's an interesting place if you're ever along the Highway 1, just go in there and imagine. It was a brutal winter, very cold, and they actually ran out of food. And if it weren't for some Indians who gave them some bulbs and some fish. There was someone else along on this trip, a wonderful Newfie called, what was his name? Seaman. And Indians loved him. He was a great entree into meeting these tribes because they had never seen a dog that big and never seen a black one. And they really tried to trade for him. You know, I'll give you all of my squaws, all my horses, just give me that dog. That was something very prized. And of course, they had this woman, and they also had someone else. Clark was a very well-to-do, had a very well-to-do family, and then he inherited a couple of his father's slaves, and one of them was a man named York. And so York went with Clark everywhere. When he visited Jefferson, he would go. And so it's just natural he would go with Lewis and Clark as Clark's manservant. But he became an excellent marksman and a good hunter. After the journey, York was freed by Clark and given some money, and he set up a farm and became a freight driver. But he was also something that the Indians were very fascinated by. And we'll tell you a story, I think, later on in this talk about a kind of interesting calling card. So York was very, very valuable on this trip. Everyone took turns, both Lewis and Clark, writing. Most everyone on the journey kept little journals themselves. The journals took a long time to be edited. Lewis wasn't a very good speller, and Clark was always trying to correct this. But these journals, it took years for these things to be edited and finally published. But word got out and people began to hear about it. And then, of course, Sacagawea, who was a young Shoshone girl who married a French trapper. And they ran into each other, and she agreed. Well, the trapper talked his way into becoming an interpreter, but she was a better interpreter. And so she went along, and on the route, she had a baby. And so just like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but did it in high heels and backwards. Well, Sacagawea walked the whole way with a baby and even ran into her people. So it's a very interesting journey. Sacagawea is honored, of course, by one of the dollars. And artists loved to portray her and imagine what she was like. She had a son, carried it all the way, Jean-Baptiste Carbonneau, who was the father's name. He survived. Lewis, or Clark, adopted him and actually raised him in St. Louis after the journey. Eventually, he was sent to Germany and spent 6 years with a duke learning German, Spanish, and French, and then eventually came back and set up a couple of businesses, including some inns and wagon hauling, drayage, and died of all places in Southern Oregon. So just imagine these lives. Your first year of your life, you're being carried across the Western United States. And of course, they used paddle boats at first, flat bottom boats, later canoes. And here is Sacagawea actually talking. This is kind of idealized. These are Haida people, and they never got that far north, but they were close to Makah and also Samish people. Another one of these expeditions that was funded by the military, Zebulon Pike, who was asked to go basically into the central part of the United States and again, find areas that were suitable for military posts and also find out what the Spanish are doing. Well, of course, he went a little farther south and he got arrested by the Spanish. They took him all the way down into Mexico, questioned him. He had a little notebook or series of notebooks with him, and they confiscated those. But they escorted him back to Texas and released him. Diplomats worked for years and years, and in 1910 managed to get his notebooks returned. And the notebooks talked about the Central Plains and also his little climb up with a few friends up to Pikes Peak, and then what the Front Range was like. He said this area, which he called the Great American Desert, was not going to be suitable for agriculture. There's no wood for building, the soil isn't very good, there's no trees, it's just grass. And so it's somewhat ironic that he couldn't envision, and who could at that time, irrigation. John Wesley Powell would do the same kind of assessment in the far west, and he said, no, this is not going to be good for irrigation, but he was right because it was nothing but basin and range. But Pike and Long were a little bit off in this. And Long was one of Pike's expedition members, but Long was asked to lead another one going north and then again going south. He was well trained. He was an engineer, a military engineer. He was instructor at West Point. He put together this government funded expedition, had 19 men, including painters and physicians, zoologists, botanists, and so on. Although men did both of these things. They didn't go all that far. They were looking for the Red River. They kind of got lost a couple times. They actually split into two different groups, and one group nearly died, and the other group actually just disappeared. But they disappeared not before taking all the journals and a lot of the specimens. And what their idea was, no one really knew, but they disappeared with all the journals, which left Long kind of with egg on his face. Oddly, one of those journals showed up again in California about 50 years later. So go figure. And Long was a very good observer, very good with Indians. He had his artists draw some of these things. He had parlays. He would make a lot of different confabs and then agreements, treaties with these Indians, because again, he was looking for ideal places for military bases. And you can see all of these were considered military men, even though they were civilian botanists and so on. The bulk of they always had a military escort with them. And John C. Fremont, a name that's very well known, of course, around here, was also a military officer, an explorer, but he was first an explorer. He was on several of these other expeditions. He did one major trip with Ashley up to Fort Vancouver, then later joined the Great Bear Lake Company and would do these trips. And then he was hired by the government to survey much of the Great Basin area and to see what the mountains were like. He came both in a northern route and he also came in the southern route. And he did encounter Indians in a number of places, and he ended up massacring several of them because he was very well armed and didn't want to risk losing some of the supplies and so on. But nonetheless, he made it all the way to Sacramento, or all the way to Monterey. In fact, he was here during the Mexican War. He became one of the first senators from California. And because he was so famous, by the time he had gotten back and gotten his journals published, that he actually made a run for the presidency of the United States. But he was also, despite being an abolitionist, he was pretty not liked well by his men and others, so his reputation was not that good, and he didn't make it. Well, sorry about this map, but this looks very much like what we saw with some of the others that would come out of the Great Bear Lake. And Fremont also had worked with Kit Carson, and Kit Carson was from Kentucky, ninth in a family of 14. They moved to Missouri, and he left home to work on the river boats, and then he became a trapper early on. He had several marriages with Indian women, and then a Spanish woman who he had 8 children. He did become a soldier in the army, making it all the way to general. He was so well skilled in the West and trapping and so on that he would be asked to do various things. He fought in the Mexican-American War, and then one of the probably sad commentaries is that he was asked to take Navajos after they rebelled, take them from Fort Defiance in Arizona and take them to a fort in New Mexico. And he got all of them together, 8,000 of them. Very few of them had horses, and he marched them all the way on their own kind of Trail of Tears. This is called the Long March. He is not well remembered by the Navajo. And one thing, they were allowed to eventually go back and were given sheep. Otherwise, they basically were starving. Local Navajo people in northern New Mexico and Arizona still repeat this trip, the long walk. Now we're going to get to a few other kinds of explorers. And one of my, well, I wouldn't say favorite, it's just a sad story. Everyone knows Douglas Fir or Douglas Iris, Douglasii this or that. This was young David Douglas, born in Scotland, worked as a gardener, self-trained. It reminds me a lot of Alfred Russel Wallace. He was self-trained, he read books, and he eventually saved up enough money and began to work on a ship that traveled from England to the South Pacific. He stopped in the Galapagos, eventually landed in the Columbia River, and he made his way quite a ways inland to Canada, and all along the way collecting things. And he encountered Indians here and there, but they thought he was a little strange because, well, he was after plants, so he must be a medicine man or something. He was even chased up a tree one time, and they shot arrows at him. And he did come down to San Francisco, Fort Ross. He made it into Monterey. And then eventually he went to Hawaii because he heard how luxurious it was. And while he was wandering around, he fell into a bull pit, and the bull gored him to death. So a very tragic end for Douglas of Douglas Fir and all the other wonderful things. When he collected, he sent seeds and pressed plants back to his friends in the Kew Gardens and elsewhere. And he discovered 200 new species in Western United States. And this was a pattern picked up by lots of people, even American botanists. John Kirk Townsend, a name some of you might be familiar with. He was invited by botanist Thomas Nuttall to join him on another government expedition crossing the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. By this time, a number of people have done this, so it's not that unique. But interestingly, he was more interested in birds, but he did the collecting of plants as well. And to keep these skins preserved as long as possible, he developed a secret formula to use in taxidermy. Unfortunately, it was very rife with arsenic, and eventually he died pretty young in his 40s of arsenic poisoning. But some of you know Nuttall's or Townsend's warbler, because it's one of the few warblers that will stay with us all winter long. His friend was Thomas Nuttall, who traveled all over the place on one of the Astor expeditions, and then a couple of other expeditions, John Bradbury and so on. And then he traveled on his own and all the way up into the Dakotas and then back. And then he fled to the United Kingdom during the War of 1812 because he was actually English. But he described lots of plants. And of course, we still call this Nuttall's woodpecker, a very unusual little one. What I find interesting, Nuttall's, I think this is Nuttall. This is a man named Asa Gray, who was the head of the botany department at Harvard University, and Nuttall and Douglas sent all kinds of specimens back. But this man is Joseph Hooker, who is best friends with Charles Darwin, and he was visiting Gray. And Gray and Darwin had a very hefty correspondence, and Gray was one of his disciples in North America. So how these people made contact with one another, and much easier, of course, in those days because not everyone was working on this. Nuttall went back and worked at the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences before he went back to England. And he had all of his specimens and he would trade them with Asa Gray. And Asa Gray included all of his things and into his massive manual, which is still in print. It's called Gray's Manual of Botany. It covers everything east of the Mississippi. Some of you may appreciate MUNS, the equivalent for California. This thing has about 3,000 plants in it. The flora of California has 6,000. And one of the interesting things, this handsome young man is Richard Henry Dana. And he was a colonial family member in Cambridge, Mass. He went to private school taught by James Russell Lowell and also headed by Emerson. He was participating in protest, and so he was suspended. So he decided he would go and sail. And he sailed around on a trading ship that went around the Horn and went up to California. And he spent 2 years going up and down the coast of California collecting hides, cattle hides, because one of the main things they had on their trading ship was boots made of California cattle. So as he was about ready to return, one of my favorite stories about him is he was sitting, and he writes this in 2 years before the mast. He was sitting on San Diego beach with all of his friends and all the people who were waiting for ships to sail with the next good tide. And there were blacks, there were Portuguese, there were Hawaiians, there were Samoans, there were Russians. And it just is, and they were all getting along. So maybe California was different in those days, or maybe it was the rum they were drinking, or the fact they were heading home. Here's a nice thing called hide droghing. These hides were stiff as boards because they were left out in the sun. And 2 years before the mast is definitely worth reading. It was the first time any white man wrote about California in a sensible way. And well, it's remarkable, basically, what he actually saw. And people bought this book as a handbook for California. He went back and, while he was on the beach in San Diego, he was walking along and he saw this old man shuffling and picking up shells. And he walked up and he said, "Professor Nuttall, it's me, your old student." So of all places to run into one another, there on a beach in San Diego, the dropout Harvard student and an activist runs into his old zoology professor. And they came back to Harvard, or came back to Cambridge on the same boat. Nuttall bringing all of his things, and likewise Dana bringing his notes. Well, let's go on, because I've got to get through Wesley Powell. Everyone has heard of John Wesley, a remarkable soldier, geologist, explorer. He lost his arm in the Battle of Shiloh during the Civil War. but he became a very active geologist and later asked to head a geologic expedition to see what the American West, where the Colorado River and beyond that was like. Nobody knew where the Colorado went. So he did 2 expeditions. Later, he became the director of the U.S. Geological Survey and then the director of the Bureau of Ethnography. He was a very open-minded man and befriended all the Indians that he did meet. He had 2 expeditions. This is the second one, and this is going from here up in the Green River, up in Wyoming, and then coming all the way down, and then eventually make it to the mouth. This is his second expedition. The first expedition was filled with, imagine going down the Grand Canyon. You had no idea what was waiting for you, how many of these waterfalls, and these waterfalls are, Colorado has its own rapid rating system. So a normal river may have a rating system of 1 to 5, but Colorado has 10. So you measure the likelihood of equipment damage or bodily damage. This is the second voyage because they took a photographer, and also Powell demanded, he was tired of rowing one-handed. He had a chair strapped on for him to actually be rowed down the river. Lots and lots of adventures. Powell got stuck on a cliff and someone had to go up and try to pull him up by one hand, of course. This is Powell. In the first trip, 2 people left almost before they went into the canyon, and then partway through the canyon, 3 others left and disappeared. It's thought that they were killed by local or by Indians. But anyway, to round this out a little bit, it's been a very masculine adventure, but Martha Maxwell, who had an interesting story, was a nanny and then married the father of the children she was taking care of, moved to Colorado, and then she began to study animals, and mostly by shooting them and then stuffing them. And she became so skilled at this, she was invited by several of the world's fairs and several museums to display her animals. And she collected a lot and would send them to people that she knew in the Smithsonian and so on. And then Bailey, Florence Augusta Merriam Bailey, she was the sister of C. Hart Merriam, who was one of the great modern explorers and collectors for the Smithsonian. He went along most of the western areas, the western mountains and the border, but she married another biologist, and she became a very good ornithologist. She started the nascent Audubon Society. She was a nature writer. She popularized ornithology and wrote the first field guide, and she collected with her husband, Vernon Bailey. And they traveled all over the West, and this was one of the formats she used, which is now the standard format. It's also a key to tell the animals apart. So she was well renowned in her ability, and she did travel to the West, but by this time, a lot of it had been tamed. And of course, how did we hear about the West? Well, any city slicker could, for a dime, buy a little kind of short novel. It's kind of not a penny dreadful, but a dime dreadful. And what their stock in trade was to kind of tell stories secondhand, like Kit Carson to the rescue and so on. And then this got taken over by the comic books. So Kit Carson lives today in comic book form. And other people like John Grizzley Adams. He was a shoemaker at first, and then became a hunter in New England, joined the gold rush in California. He had a little ranch, but he lost that. And so he began to hunt and supply miners with food. And of course, that's where most people made their money. If you could supply them with tough clothing or really good tents like Levi Strauss did, you would make millions of money. Or if you were like the Folger brothers and supply everyone with coffee, you made tons of money. Or if you could feed them elk or ducks or whatever, and this is what Grizzly Adams did. He would shoot bear all the time, and he would get attacked by bear. Eventually, he pulled out a couple of cubs and tried to train them. He also made his own clothing, but eventually he did get a bear, and his bear became quite friendly and grew up with him, and he would do sideshows with it. And he even set up one in downtown San Francisco where he showed his bear. And then he was invited toward the end of his life to New York to show off his bear. And then eventually, after performing several times, he retired to Massachusetts, where he was born. And just days after he retired and arrived in Massachusetts, he died. But he lived for a time, I should mention too, in Livermore, and he got his grizzly bears up in the Hamilton Range. So everyone thinks of Grizzly Adams and thinks immediately of the Rockies. No, he mostly worked in the California foothills and in the Hamilton Range. And of course, Grizzly Adam just kind of has a nice name, ring to the name. Lives on in not only comic books, but TV programs and bad movies. But there is still a real Grizzly Seuss, who's now getting up there in age. But if you ever see a grizzly bear in the movies, it's Bart, or Son of Bart. And Bart's been in lots and lots of movies. He is scary to behold, but really your biggest friend for life if you get to know him. Just to finish up, I'm getting close. I've been talking about botany, zoology, geology, but at this time, especially from the English, there was a new science coming into being named anthropology. And here is Frank Hamilton Cushing. He actually studied and then got a job as an ethnologist at the National Museum. He was invited by John Wesley Powell to join the Stevenson's anthropological expedition to New Mexico. So some studies were going on in the late 1800s, and Cushing was fascinated by the Zunis, and he, as they say, went native. The very thing that everyone's afraid will happen happened, and he became basically adopted into a Zuni warrior class. But he really got to understand them, and he wrote many, many books about their mythology. He also acted out the stories in many cases, and he would go really native. And he started dressing in his own clothing and so on that he would make. But his contributions were enormous. Especially in folklore and so on. Now, one of the people that made anthropology quite famous is a German who came to the United States first on the west coast of British Columbia and worked with the Haida and Kwakiutl, and then got a job at Columbia, Franz Boas, and was a very remarkable, influential thinker. And he had a series of graduate students who read like a who's who. And one of the interesting things that happened, one of his first graduate students was a man named Alfred Lewis Kroeber, and along with Robert Lowy, they both got jobs at the brand new, basically new University of California at Berkeley. And Kroeber and Lowy did the same thing that Boas taught them to do, and he studied the California Indians in a Herculean effort to save what left of the oral traditions and so on. Ashley Montague is a modern, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Zora Hurston, who was a Black female writer, but she did folklore work in East Indians. His influence is remarkable, and especially these people. One last story. Some of you may have heard of, some of you maybe not. A young family joins a Mormon kind of outlaw group, and they travel from Illinois and they're headed down on the Santa Fe Trail. Near Needles, they have by this time actually been separated from the main group, and they are attacked by Indians, and the family is basically killed. She sees her brother beaten and clubbed, and he almost is left for dead. But she and her little sister are kidnapped and taken away. The little sister, we don't know, maybe lasted with this tribe for 1 year. After that year, she's traded to the Mojaves, and so somewhere near the present day Oatman is where she's attacked, the family is attacked and killed. The remains of the family are found and taken down to the fort, Fort Yuma. And so the word spreads that they've been killed, except the 2 women are missing. She is traded to the Mojave. She lives for 4 years. Her brother, Lorenzo, is actually alive. And once he recovers, he spends the rest of the next 5 years looking for them. They've heard rumors, but eventually through trading and bartering and the military, they get her back and she's repatriated. But she is tattooed. And so her life is forever marked, and she's known as the tattooed woman who lived in captivity with the Mojaves. She wrote a story herself. She did speeches, and this has been long recycled with lots and lots of liberties into movies and plays and so on. Once she was liberated, a Reverend Stratton found her and began to write her story down. This is Reverend Stratton's book in 1859. It sells extremely well. This is Olive when she was younger. And so he adopts both Olive and Lorenzo. With the money he pays for both of their educations at the University of Pacific. They go on tour all over the country speaking. She meets a rancher up in Michigan. They move to Texas. They live together. She adopts a child. And then the rancher dies and she dies 2 years later. And she's buried in Texas. There have been several movie versions, really awful, but this is a story that is really fascinating and gripping. There have been others like it, but you wouldn't know anything about the people. But since she is tattooed, you knew something was going on. This, she claimed, was a mark of slavery. No, it doesn't mean that among the Mojaves. It means you're a member of the tribe. So there's her brother, and there she is later in life. So with that, I'll end it. And we do have some time for questions. And I realize